The sheriff's men nailed the eviction notice to the door while the morning frost still clung to the windows, and 14-year-old Kora Whitfield stood barefoot on the porch of the only home she'd ever known, watching two strangers in long coats tell her she had until sundown to leave. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stood there, her mother's old wool shawl wrapped around her thin shoulders, and read every word of that notice, the way she read everything, carefully, slowly, and all the way to the end. The paper said the land belonged to the county now. It said the back taxes owed by her late father, Thomas Whitfield, exceeded the value of the property. It said the sheriff of Granger County, Tennessee, had the legal authority to seize and auction the 40-acre parcel, including the house, the barn, and everything inside. What it didn't say, what no piece of paper could ever capture, was that this land had been in the Whitfield family for 3 generations, that her grandfather had cleared these fields with his own hands, pulling stones from the red clay soil until his fingers bled, that her mother, Eliza, had planted the dogwood trees that lined the front path the year Kora was born, that her father had died of pneumonia the previous winter, coughing until the walls shook, and her mother had followed him into the ground just 5 weeks later, taken by the same sickness that crept through the hollow like a fog. Kora was the last Whitfield, and now she was the last Whitfield with nothing. The truth behind that eviction was darker than any legal document would ever admit. Sheriff Vernon Briggs had wanted the Whitfield land for years. It sat on a south-facing slope above Caney Creek, with rich bottomland and a natural spring that never went dry, not even in the drought of 1930. When Thomas Whitfield was alive, Briggs couldn't touch it. Thomas paid his taxes every year, walked into the county office with cash he'd earned selling tobacco and corn, and looked the sheriff straight in the eye. But Thomas was dead now, and Eliza was dead, and all that stood between Vernon Briggs and that perfect piece of land was a skinny 14-year-old girl who read too many books and talked to plants like they could hear her. The neighbors knew what was happening. Every last one of them knew. But this was 1934, in the pit of the Depression, and nobody in Granger County had the money or the courage to challenge a sheriff who controlled half the businesses in town. Mrs. Harlan from down the road came by that morning with a basket of biscuits and a look on her face like she was attending a funeral. "I'm sorry, child," she said. "I wish there was something I could do." But she didn't offer Kora a place to stay. Nobody did. If you want to find out how a barefoot orphan went from losing everything to growing wheat inside a mountain cave that would one day save an entire county from starvation, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what Kora Whitfield built in the darkness of that cave became something the people of Granger County still talk about to this day. The people of Granger had always thought Kora Whitfield was a strange child. Even before her parents died, she was different from the other children in the hollow. While the other girls her age helped their mothers with canning and quilting and learned to keep their mouths shut and their eyes down, Kora was out in the fields with her father, asking questions about soil composition and rainfall patterns and why the corn grew taller on the south side of the hill. She read everything she could get her hands on: seed catalogs, farming bulletins, even the labels on fertilizer bags at the general store. Her grandmother on her mother's side, who came to visit every Christmas, once told Eliza that the girl needed to learn her place before life taught it to her the hard way. Eliza had smiled politely and said nothing, and later that evening, she'd slipped Kora a new book about botany that she'd ordered through the mail. After Eliza died, the women of Granger had tried, half-heartedly, to find a place for Kora. Mrs. Dalton at the Baptist church suggested she could work as a house girl for one of the wealthier families in town. Mrs. Phelps thought she might be sent to the state orphanage in Knoxville. But before any of those conversations went anywhere, Sheriff Briggs had filed his tax claim, and the question became moot. Nobody was going to fight for a girl who had no land, no family, and no future that anyone could see. Kora packed what she could carry into her father's old canvas rucksack: a change of clothes, her mother's Bible, a pouch of dried beans, a knife with a bone handle that had belonged to her grandfather, and 3 books: a dog-eared copy of Farmer's Bulletin number 616 from the United States Department of Agriculture, a battered almanac from 1929, and a slim volume called The Principles of Soil and Plant Growth that her schoolteacher, Miss Abernathy, had given her the year before. Miss Abernathy was the only adult who'd ever told Kora that her curiosity wasn't a flaw. "You have a mind like good soil, Kora," she'd said. "Everything you put in it grows." Kora left the house at noon, walking north on the dirt road toward the mountains. She didn't look back, not because she didn't care, but because she knew if she turned around, she would see the dogwood trees her mother had planted, and she would fall apart. She walked for 2 days. She slept the first night under a rock overhang near Painter Creek, shivering under her shawl, listening to the coyotes call across the ridge. By the second morning, she had climbed above the tree line on Buckhorn Mountain, following a game trail that wound between massive limestone outcroppings. The air was thinner here, colder, and she could see the whole valley spread out below her like a quilt: the patchwork of brown fields, the thin ribbon of the road, the cluster of buildings that was the town of Granger. It was late afternoon on the second day when she found the cave. She almost walked right past it. The entrance was narrow, hidden behind a curtain of dead sumac and Virginia creeper, no wider than a doorway. But a draft of warm air brushed her face as she passed, and Kora stopped. Warm air in October, coming from inside a mountain. She knew what that meant. She'd read about it. Caves maintained a constant temperature year-round, somewhere around 55 degrees. In winter, they were warmer than the outside air. In summer, they were cooler. She pushed through the brush and stepped inside. The entrance tunnel was dark and narrow, but after about 30 feet, it opened into a chamber that took her breath away. The cave was enormous, a cathedral of stone with a ceiling that arched 50 feet above her head. Stalactites hung like frozen chandeliers, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of fine, silty sediment that had been washed in by an underground stream over thousands of years. That stream still ran along the far wall, clear and cold, trickling over smooth stones before disappearing into a crack in the rock. But it was the light that made Kora's heart pound. High on the south-facing wall of the chamber, there were openings, not exactly windows, but natural gaps in the limestone where the rock had eroded away, letting in shafts of pale October sunlight that fell across the cave floor like spotlights. The largest opening was perhaps 4 feet wide and 2 feet tall, and through it, Kora could see the sky. She stood in the middle of that cave for a long time, turning slowly, her mind already working. 55 degrees, natural light, water, sediment that looked and felt like the lowest soil she'd read about in her agriculture bulletin. Fine, mineral-rich, the kind of soil that had made the Mississippi Delta the most productive farmland in the world. "I can grow things here," she whispered. She said it out loud because she needed to hear it. She needed to believe it. The first 2 months nearly killed her. The cave kept her from freezing, but 55 degrees is still cold when you're sleeping on stone with nothing but a wool shawl for a blanket. She survived on dried beans, creek water, and whatever she could forage. Black walnuts, persimmons that had been softened by frost, the inner bark of slippery elm that she boiled into a bitter but nourishing tea. She lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Her fingers cracked and bled. There were nights when she lay on the cave floor and wondered if she would wake up in the morning. But she did wake up. Every morning. And every morning she got to work. She started by studying the light. Over the course of 3 weeks, she mapped exactly where the sunlight fell at different times of day, marking the cave floor with small stones. She discovered that the main chamber received roughly 6 hours of direct light during the shortest days of winter. Not enough for most crops, but enough, she believed, for wheat. Winter wheat, the variety her father had grown on the lower fields. It was hardy, cold-tolerant, and it could germinate at temperatures as low as 40 degrees. The cave floor stayed at 55. If she could prepare the soil and get seeds in the ground, the wheat would grow slowly through the winter and be ready to harvest by late spring. The problem was seeds. She had none. It was this problem that led her to Silas Thorne. Silas lived alone in a cabin about 2 miles down the north face of Buckhorn Mountain. He was 73 years old, a former mining engineer who had come to the mountains 30 years earlier after his wife and son died of typhoid in Knoxville. He had lived alone ever since, growing a small garden, trapping rabbits, and reading by candlelight. The people in Granger called him a hermit. Some called him crazy. But when Kora appeared at his door one December morning, half-starved and shaking, he didn't turn her away. He sat her down by his stove, fed her cornbread and venison stew, and listened while she told him everything. Then he did something no one else had done. He asked her about her plan, not whether she had a plan. He could see it in her eyes, the feverish, determined look of someone who was already building something in their mind. He asked her what it was. When she told him about the cave, about the light and the temperature and the sediment floor, about growing winter wheat underground, Silas Thorne leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You'll need to build terraces. That sediment's no good in a flat layer. The water will pool and rot the roots. You'll need to build it up in steps, use the creek to irrigate, and channel the runoff so it doesn't flood the chamber." He said it matter-of-factly, as if a 14-year-old girl proposing underground agriculture inside a limestone cave was the most natural thing in the world. Silas gave her seeds, winter wheat, rye, and a small pouch of turnip seeds that he'd been saving. He also gave her tools, a hand trowel, a hoe with a short handle, and a pickaxe for breaking up the harder sections of the cave floor. Over the following weeks, he came to the cave himself, despite his bad knees and his age, and helped Kora design a terrace system that would turn the cave's natural slope into a series of growing platforms. They built 6 terraces, each about 4 feet wide and 20 feet long, stepping down from the south wall toward the creek. Kora hauled sediment from the cave floor and mixed it with decomposed leaf litter and bat guano she scraped from a smaller side chamber, a combination that created a growing medium rich in nitrogen and phosphorus. She lined the terraces with flat stones to hold them in place, and dug narrow channels between each level so the creek water could flow down from terrace to terrace, irrigating each one before draining back into the stream. The wheat went in on January 3rd, 1935. Kora planted each seed by hand, spacing them 2 inches apart, pressing them into the soil with her thumb. She planted 600 seeds on the first terrace alone, and then she waited. The waiting was the hardest part. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. The cave was silent except for the trickle of the creek and the drip of water from the stalactites. Kora checked the soil every day, pressing her fingers into the damp earth, looking for any sign of life. On January 19th, she saw the first green shoot. It was so small, she almost missed it. A pale thread of green pushing up through the dark soil, no bigger than an eyelash. But it was there. Life, growing in the belly of a mountain, in the dead of winter. Kora sat down on the cave floor and cried for the first time since she'd left home. By March, the first terrace was covered in a carpet of green wheat, about 8 inches tall and growing steadily in the filtered light. The turnips on the lower terraces were producing greens that Kora ate raw, the first fresh vegetables she'd had in months. The rye was slower, but coming in strong, its blue-green blades thicker and more robust than the wheat. Silas came to see it and stood at the entrance of the chamber for a full minute without speaking. Then he took off his hat, as if he were standing in church. "Girl," he said, "I've been an engineer for 40 years, and I've never seen anything like this." Through the spring of 1935, Kora expanded. She cleared a second chamber deeper in the cave, one that received less direct light, but stayed warmer due to its distance from the entrance. Here she grew root vegetables, potatoes, beets, carrots, crops that didn't need as much light. She developed a system of reflective surfaces, positioning flat pieces of mica and quartz she found in the cave walls to redirect sunlight deeper into the chambers. It wasn't sophisticated, but it worked. The light bounced from stone to stone, spreading further into the darkness. She harvested her first wheat in May. 40 pounds from the 6 terraces. It wasn't much by farming standards, but it was 40 pounds of grain that had grown inside a mountain, without a plow, without a mule, without a single acre of open land. Kora ground it by hand, using 2 flat stones, and baked her first loaf of bread over a fire at the cave entrance. She brought a loaf to Silas. He ate it slowly, chewing each bite like it was something precious. "Tastes like regular bread," he said. Kora smiled. "That's the point." Over the next 2 years, Kora transformed the cave into something that had no name, because nothing like it had ever existed before. She expanded to 12 terraces, then 20. She discovered that the side chambers, though darker, could support mushrooms. She cultivated shiitake and oyster mushrooms on rotting logs she dragged in from the forest. She built a crude root cellar in the deepest part of the cave, where the temperature never varied by more than a degree, and stored her harvest through the hottest months of summer. By 1937, she was producing over 300 pounds of grain per year, along with potatoes, turnips, carrots, beets, and more mushrooms than she could eat. She had also begun experimenting with herbs. Rosemary, thyme, and sage grew surprisingly well in the drier sections near the cave entrance, where the air circulated freely and the light was strongest. She dried them in bundles hung from the stalactites, and the cave took on a fragrance that was part earth, part garden, part something ancient and wild that had no name. She rigged a simple ventilation system using the cave's natural drafts, propping open certain passages with stones to increase airflow when the air grew too damp, and blocking them when she needed to retain warmth. She learned to read the cave the way a sailor reads the sea, by feel, by instinct, by the subtle changes in humidity and temperature that told her when a frost was coming outside or when the spring rains were about to raise the creek level. She began trading her surplus with families in the valleys below, quietly at first, through Silas, who would carry sacks of flour and baskets of vegetables to the small communities on the north side of the mountain, places too remote and too poor to be under Sheriff Briggs's thumb. Word spread slowly, the way it does in mountain communities, not through newspapers or announcements, but through the grapevine of women talking over clotheslines and men sharing a jar at the end of a long day. People began to hear about the girl on Buckhorn Mountain who grew food inside the earth. Some thought it was a tall tale. Some thought it was witchcraft. But the families who ate her bread and fed her turnips to their children didn't care what it was. They called it a blessing. By 1938, Kora had become something she never intended to be: a teacher. Families started coming to the cave, not to buy food, but to learn. Kora showed them how to identify cave sites with the right conditions: the temperature, the light, the water, the soil. She taught them about terracing, about nitrogen-fixing crops, about crop rotation in confined spaces. She gave away seeds from her harvest, carefully saved and dried, and helped 3 other families start their own small cave gardens on Buckhorn Mountain. Silas Thorne died in the winter of 1939. He went quietly, in his sleep, in the cabin he'd lived in for 30 years. Kora was with him. She'd been checking on him every day since his health had started to decline the previous autumn, bringing him bread and soup, reading to him from the engineering textbooks he kept stacked beside his bed. In his will, a single sheet of paper written in his careful engineer's hand, he left Kora everything he owned: the cabin, the land, his tools, and his books. To Kora Whitfield, it read, who proved that the best engineering is done with seeds. By 1940, Kora's operation had grown beyond anything she could have imagined on that cold October day when she'd first pushed through the brush at the cave entrance. She was 20 years old, strong and weathered, with calloused hands and eyes that still held the same fierce curiosity they'd had at 14. She had expanded into 4 separate cave chambers, connected by passages she'd widened with the pickaxe Silas had given her. Her annual grain production exceeded 1,000 pounds. Her network of cave farmers, families she'd taught and supplied with seeds, numbered over a dozen across 3 mountain communities. And then the crisis came. The summer of 1941 brought a drought to Granger County that old-timers said was the worst since 1874. The creeks dried up. The wells dropped. The crops in the open fields, the corn, the tobacco, the beans that fed the valley, withered and died under a sun that burned white in a cloudless sky for 67 straight days. By August, families in Granger were going hungry. Children were getting sick. The stores in town had rationed what little they had, and the prices were beyond what most people could pay. Sheriff Vernon Briggs, who had spent the last 7 years profiting from the Whitfield land, which, it turned out, wasn't nearly as productive without a Whitfield working it, found himself in a position he'd never imagined. The people he'd controlled through money and influence were now desperate, and desperate people are dangerous. They were looking for someone to blame, and they were also looking for someone to help. The first wagon from Granger arrived at the base of Buckhorn Mountain on August 14th. It carried Mrs. Harlan, the same woman who had brought biscuits and an apology 7 years earlier, and 3 other women from town. They had heard about the cave. Everyone had heard about the cave by now. They came to ask for food. Kora could have turned them away. No one would have blamed her. These were people who had watched a 14-year-old girl get thrown off her family's land and hadn't lifted a finger to stop it. They had looked the other way while a corrupt sheriff stole an orphan's inheritance. They had the decency to feel guilty about it, perhaps, but guilt without action is just comfort for cowards. But Kora wasn't interested in justice of that kind. She never had been. She loaded the wagon with 200 pounds of wheat flour, 50 pounds of potatoes, bushels of turnips and beets, and as many mushrooms as the women could carry. She asked for nothing in return. "Tell anyone who's hungry to come," she said, "and tell them to bring something to carry food in." Over the next 3 months, Kora Whitfield fed Granger County. Her cave stores, built up over years of careful cultivation and preservation, held enough to supplement the diets of over 400 people through the worst of the drought. Families who had never spoken to her lined up at the base of Buckhorn Mountain every Saturday, and Kora distributed food with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything she did. She didn't make speeches. She didn't demand apologies. She just handed out sacks of flour and told people to come back next week. Some of those people couldn't look her in the eye. They remembered. They remembered the morning the sheriff's men had come, and they remembered what they had done, which was nothing. A few tried to apologize, stumbling, awkward words that came out sideways, the way shame always sounds when it finally speaks. Kora accepted their apologies the way she accepted everything, simply, without drama, and with her hands already reaching for the next sack of flour. There was one man, old Pete Yancey, who had been on the county board when the tax seizure was approved. He came up the mountain alone on a Tuesday, hat in his hands, and stood before Kora for a full minute before he could speak. "I signed the papers," he said. "I knew what Briggs was doing, and I signed them anyway because I owed him money. I've carried that every day since." Kora handed him a bag of potatoes. "Then put it down," she said. Sheriff Briggs did not come to the mountain, but his wife did. She came alone, in a clean dress and good shoes that weren't made for climbing, and she stood in front of Kora with tears running down her face and said, "My husband took your land. I knew it was wrong, and I said nothing. I am sorry." Kora looked at her for a long moment. Then she handed her a sack of flour and said, "Your children need to eat too." After the drought broke, something shifted in Granger County. It was slow and it was imperfect, the way change always is, but it was real. Sheriff Briggs lost the next election by a margin so wide that even his allies couldn't pretend it was close. The new sheriff, a young veteran named Robert Calloway, opened an investigation into the Whitfield land seizure. It took 2 years, but in 1944, the county court ruled that the original eviction had been conducted fraudulently. The Whitfield land was returned to Kora. She never moved back. By then, the cave and Silas's cabin were her home. The mountain was her home. She married Robert Calloway in 1945 in a small ceremony at the cave entrance, a location she chose because, she said, it was where her life had truly begun. They had 4 children, all of whom grew up learning to farm underground before they learned to farm above it. Kora spent the next 4 decades expanding her work. She corresponded with agricultural researchers at the University of Tennessee, who were fascinated by her techniques and published papers on what they called subterranean agriculture. She hosted visitors from across the country, farmers, scientists, government agents from the Department of Agriculture, who came to see the cave and left shaking their heads in amazement. She taught hundreds of families her methods, adapting them for different climates, different cave systems, different crops. In the 1960s, when the war on poverty brought federal attention to Appalachia, Kora was invited to Washington to testify before a congressional subcommittee on rural food security. She wore her good dress and her work boots, and she brought a loaf of bread baked from cave-grown wheat. She set it on the table in front of the senators and said, "This bread was grown inside a mountain by a woman who was told she had nothing. If I could do that with a cave and some seeds, imagine what your programs could accomplish if you actually listened to the people you're trying to help." The senators ate the bread. Some of them even listened. She never wrote a book, though many people asked her to. Books are for people who've stopped learning, she said once, which was her way of saying she was too busy doing the work to write about it. Kora Whitfield Calloway died on March 7, 1993, at the age of 73. She died in the cabin that Silas Thorne had left her, with her children and grandchildren around her and the mountain she loved visible through every window. The town of Granger, which had long since named a street, a school, and an annual harvest festival after her, declared a day of mourning. But her legacy didn't mourn. It kept growing. Her children continued the cave farming operations. Her grandchildren studied agriculture and food science at universities, carrying her methods into new contexts and new technologies. The network of cave farms she'd established across the Appalachian region continued to operate, feeding families in communities where conventional farming struggled. In 2001, the University of Tennessee's Agricultural Extension Program established the Kora Whitfield Fellowship, a grant for young researchers studying alternative growing environments. The cave itself became a kind of pilgrimage site. People came from all over to walk through the terraces she'd built, to see the channels she'd carved, to stand in the shafts of light that fell through the limestone walls and understand what one girl had seen when everyone else saw only darkness. A small plaque was placed at the entrance in 2005, funded by donations from families across the region. It reads simply, "Kora Whitfield found this cave in 1934. She was 14 years old, alone, and had nothing. She turned it into a farm that fed a county and changed a way of life. The light was always here. She was the first one to use it." So here's the question this story leaves us with, and it's not a comfortable one. What are you doing with what you've been given? Not what you wish you'd been given, not what you think you deserve. What are you doing with what's actually in front of you? The raw, imperfect, maybe even unfair hand that life has dealt you right now. Kora Whitfield wasn't given a farm. She was given a cave. She wasn't given a family. She was given solitude. She wasn't given tools or money or support. She was given seeds, a knife, and 3 books. And she turned those things into something that fed hundreds of people and lasted for generations. She didn't wait for the world to be fair. She didn't wait for someone to rescue her. She didn't waste her energy on anger, though she had every right to be angry. She took what was in front of her, stone, water, light, dirt, and she built. The qualities that got her thrown out of Granger County were the same qualities that saved it. Her curiosity, her stubbornness, her refusal to accept that the world had to be the way it was. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the caves in your own life, the dark places where something might be waiting to grow, hit subscribe for more stories about ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. And remember what Silas Thorne said when he saw wheat growing inside a mountain for the first time. Sometimes the best work is done with seeds.